video, we're going to talk about the inefficiency of monopoly. It's very important to bear in mind we're talking about a static setting here. Okay, so we're just taking the marginal cost curve as a given, right? Not asking where it came from. So after we do the analysis, it's worth taking a moment or two to kind of step back and then ask whether this is really the whole story or whether we need to ask, well, is there something else that we need to consider? Yeah. First thing we're going to do is we're going to look at our benchmark, which is the competitive market outcome. And so if we were in a competitive market, we would have the quantity produced would be out here at QC, where marginal cost is equal to, right, marginal benefit. Remember, marginal benefit comes from the demand curve. And then the pricing in a competitive market would be here. Well, what about pricing for a monopolist? Remember, if it's monopoly, monopolistic competition, we use the same way of analyzing the quantity and price. Right, we look for where marginal cost intersects marginal revenue. So this is the quantity that the monopolist would produce. And to get the price, we go up to our demand curve. So here's our price. And so when we're comparing the outcomes, of course, the first thing we note is that the monopolist produces less than the allocatively efficient amount. Remember, allocative efficiency is defined as producing where marginal cost of production equals marginal benefit, but clearly we get underproduction in the monopoly case. Same thing we saw with monopolistic competition, right? So this is really a feature anytime we have any degree of market power for the firm. And the second thing you'll notice is that the price is higher. So what does this mean for us in terms of efficiency? Well, what we like to do is track our changes in surplus, right? So if we look at this, what happens to the consumer and the producer surplus? And we're using, again, as our starting point, we think about the competitive market, okay? So if you're looking at this, so we have this upper triangle here. We'll call this A, right? And so A is all of this here. Here's A. We'll have this rectangle B. And then we've got this triangle C. And then I'm actually just going to label this as D, and E is going to be all of this down here. Right. So these areas that we've outlined here in blue, those are the different areas that we're looking at. Okay, and so remember, so the marginal revenue curve here is not, it's running through these areas, but it's not separating any of these areas out. Okay, so what is our consumer surplus and producer surplus? So under competition, and under perfect competition, and under monopoly. Okay. So under perfect competition, our consumer surplus is A, B, and C. Remember, it's the area under the demand curve down to the price that's being charged and out to the quantity, which is at QC. So consumer surplus is A, B, and C, and producer surplus is E and D, right here. It's the area above the supply curve up to the price, or I'll write it as D plus E. Okay. So total surplus, which is just the sum of the two, is A plus B plus C plus D plus E. Okay. Now what about in the case of monopoly? Well, in the case of monopoly, now consumers, the price goes up to PM, the quantity consumed falls from QC to QM, so they're only left with A now. Right? Consumers are only left with A. So what's the change? They end up losing B and C. Okay? The producers now get B and E, right? The quantity is the area above the supply curve, out to the quantity and up to the price. So they have B plus E. Okay. And so for them, the net change is, so they're getting to keep E, right? And they're losing D but gaining B. Okay. And so you've got A plus B plus E is our total surplus. So either way you look at it, so what's the difference? Well, if you take the difference here, A, B, C, D, and E, now you're left with just B and E. So that's a loss of C and D. And you can see that by adding the two changes here as well, right? The consumers are losing B, but B is just being transferred to the producers. But the consumers are also losing surplus of C, and the producers are losing D. So the net change in the end is C and D. And we will refer to C and D, right, those two lost pieces of surplus, as our dead weight loss. So that is our inefficiency in the market. It is the loss of surplus, right, total surplus, relative to the competitive, right, the efficient outcome. And again, it's important to note that consumers are actually worse off in terms of losing B and C, but B is not a loss to society as a whole. It's a transfer from consumers to producers. Okay, so it's not inefficient. I mean, you may not like the outcome because you may not like that the firms are being made better off, or the firm, I should say it's a monopolist, at the expense of the consumer, but from an efficiency standpoint, it doesn't matter who's getting that surplus, right? We're not talking about equity, we're just talking about efficiency. So you look at this basic static analysis here and you say, oh, well, monopoly is bad, right? It's inefficient. We have to take a step back and ask, well, how did we get this marginal cost curve? Right? Where did the costs come from? Where is innovation coming from? Are monopolists more likely to innovate than competitive firms who are operating with razor-thin margins? Right? What about cases of natural monopoly as well, right? So you have to think about a natural monopoly with a downward sloping average cost curve. Okay? In that, and everywhere, downward sloping average cost curve. In that case, we know that it's actually more efficient for a single firm to produce everything. It's just a question of, well, what will the actual outcome be? How much will they produce? And so we'll actually take a look at that in our next video. So how does a government regulate a natural monopoly so that we can get a more efficient outcome?